I think the much more like meaningful one is to take a very concentrated bet and say, hey, like here's something that we believe, or here's the archetype that we sort of represent. And if you subscribe to it, wonderful. You'd probably be a great fit for a community. If you don't, maybe there's a place for you, but it may not be as clean.
Hey, Smokey.
Hey man, how's it going?
Good, good. Just to tell you about this day that we're organizing here, the general idea is that culture is the most important part in crypto and, creating something valuable and meaningful. And we kind of forgot it, that's how crypto started. And then like since 2017 until now, we have like a kind of VC dumping on retail game. I mean, for the most part, I don't want to say it on everything, but I feel like the industry needs to go back to values and beliefs. And I just feel that there are a few projects in crypto that understand very deeply in their actions. And I think Berachain is one of them. So just wanted to, speak about the principles, the community, and then other builders can also learn from that. So yeah, so that's a general idea.
Yeah, sure thing, man. So context over here is that I basically started on, pretty much the opposite side of things. My career was originally in like research and healthcare and biotech. So studied engineering at the University of Waterloo and was very much more like, I guess like a pure science kind of guy, and built my first company in the biotech space, but also went out to the Bay Area and raised venture capital, et cetera, and was living in SF. And one of my first investors in that company, one of my first angels was like fairly involved in, sort of in the ETH Foundation and was in a leadership role there. And actually, another one of my investors was like a big polka dot guy, which I thought was really funny, and I kind of forgot about for a little while. But TLDR is like a lot of folks who were involved in my first company, which was like in the life sciences space, were very crypto adjacent. And also, I think when you're living in the Bay Area, sort of like that like 2015, 2016 timeframe, you end up running into a lot of people who I think were starting to sort of like help set the baseline for where the industry might go over time. And just talking to those folks, I was like, okay, cool. There's kind of something cool here. So just decided to buy a little bit of ETH, a little bit of Bitcoin, and then also as just probably a degenerate at heart, sort of continued doing so over the 2017, 2018 cycle, and bought and sold a lot of coins, had some fun with it, and then started building, I'd say, more seriously, or thinking about the space more seriously around DeFi summers like 2019, 2020. Had a number of real life friends who were pretty prominent and pretty active on crypto Twitter as well. So with that, I think it sort of became a little bit of like a rabbit hole for me. As also the concept is always cool, and I think the idea of like owning your own banking rails is always kind of cool. As a Canadian, like living in the US, I remember I always had like a pain in the ass just like setting up like bank accounts, like handling like money transfers and whatnot. And that's like one of the more friendly examples, right? Like Canadian and US, not that bad. But like, Swedish, Persian, and Nigeria, like I imagine you have like a trickier sell there, right? So I think that I got to experience a little bit of it firsthand, but really I just thought they were interesting, financial games to be built and discovered. So yeah, man, sort of like popped in there, had some fun with it. And then we started building Berachain very much by accident in the summer of 2021. There was sort of a pretty meaningful, you know, like NFT boom, I'd say, during that time frame. And it was sort of these NFTs that were no longer just like memes or no longer just pictures of apes and whatnot. They were actually a little bit more utility driven. They might have yield accruing to them. They broadly just seemed like they could be a little bit funkier. And I thought that was a pretty interesting concept. So myself, my co-founder Papa, who I've worked with for the better part of the last decade. In between building my first company in Berachain, I was a VC for some time and was raising and deploying venture capital funds, and we worked together on that. We just thought it could be a cool experiment to just, try seeing what it would look like to build an NFT collection and an NFT community. But what was interesting here is that we had spent a long time, for the most part, in like these heavily DeFi oriented communities. So I think like Frax and Curve and Redact, Olympus and like, Alchemix, that entire like, DeFi 2.0, if you want to call it, ecosystem. We ended up effectively raffling off these NFTs of bears with bongs to like 100 people from these communities. And I think that sort of set us on an interesting trajectory of, building I guess, a community that had NFT-like mimetics or dynamics, but had a very different makeup from typical NFT communities. And that it wasn't like wag me, like we love digital ownership. It was a bunch of people who were like fucking around in DeFi and enjoying, building and seeing cool new things there. So I think a lot of it sort of spiraled out of like that initial sequence of events. And then, over time that sort of evolved into what Berachain is now. And there's been a number of steps along the way that I can sort of dive into in greater depth as needed.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. You basically saw the two cultures and you kind of merged them, right? Like the beauty of NFT in terms of the mimetic and the tribalism, and then like the love of DeFi and playing around with DeFi, and you kind of made something that combined those two.
Yeah, I think NFTs have typically done a really good job of, building communities or building cults or just giving a sense of like belonging. I think they've done so in a manner that's more meaningful than meme coins to date, even though those are probably like the next closest thing. Um, And I think that, we just sort of had a happy accident there. It wasn't overly engineered. It was very much, "Oh, okay, cool. Like we like this. These people like this. Let's see what happens if we put two and two together, right?" And I think that we got the right blend of both sides. We got the sophisticated DeFi slash sophisticated on-chain user base that you tend to get, from a DeFi community. But we also got the risk on nature and sort of like, silliness that you sometimes get from an NFT community, right? So that's very much, I think, how like the initial culture was built or set.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how did the community got started? I guess you start from, I guess, an NFT collection, and then what, like, how you brought the DeFi kind of dynamics and tribes into the picture. I mean, before proof of liquidity, like what was the community like before?
Yeah, before that, it was honestly just multiplying bears, which is to say that, we've seen a lot of different ways of growing an NFT community. Some people are just like, yeah, let's do some marketing and like, let's like, issue another collection and blah blah blah. We didn't really air for that approach as much. We were just like, no, that sounds like it might be really cursed. I think what we found more interesting was, we had spent a whole bunch of time in the Olympus DAO ecosystem as well. And one of the kind of cool things there was like this rebasing mechanism that theoretically leads to better distribution over time, which is always entertaining, right? Now with Olympus, they did that at like 8,000% APY, and it was a little bit much, a little bit more than one might have bargained for. In this case, it was a lot more like, hey, if you have one collection of bears that we started with, then when there is a second collection, you'll get one of those for free, and there'll be a few more that are minted that people can basically buy to enter circulation at like a lower price. And then if you owned one though, the first and second set, then you get two of the third collection. And if you owned, those four, then you get four in the next collection, so on and so forth. So what you ended up doing was effectively, rewarding the earliest holders, of course, allowing for some degree of concentration as well, whether that be good or bad, but also decreasing the scarcity of like the collections as a whole, such that more and more people could enter. And by doing so, you sort of just ended up with this kind of fun, I guess, like set of game theories or, liquidity dynamics, if you will, where people are like, oh, how much is the next collection going to be worth? Should I hold all of my bears here or should I sell one, take my profits, rinse and repeat, etc. Um, and I think that that's sort of like, I don't know exactly what the right way to think of it is, like Russian nesting dolls type structure, just allowed us to have a bunch of people who, made a bunch of money, which I think is important in initially putting together a community, and B, enjoyed like the game theory, the concepts there in terms of just being like, okay, cool, what are these actually going to be worth as these collections expand and multiply over time? So that's sort of how we went at it, man.
Wow, that's amazing. And Bill for Monad was previously here, and he said something very interesting, like reward loyalty and reward agency. So I think that's also something that you are mentioning now, that people that are sticking around, getting more and more agency and more kind of roles. But besides getting more NFTs, what were the things that you did over time that kind of facilitate leadership with people that you see are more and more engaged? Were there other things like roles, like other responsibilities that you gave people that
Minimally. To be honest, man, I think there's a number of different ways of going about it. I think that I've seen a lot of groups more recently take a more, what I would consider as like disingenuine approach to community building,
Right.
and that there's some like multiple degrees of incentivization and like, hey, if I jump through this hoop, then I'll be able to get access to this, and that'll get me access to Y, and it just ends up being like this weird, labyrinth of games to play in search of some potential payoff. And maybe that's an airdrop, maybe that's access to an alpha chat, blah, blah, blah. Almost all of it ends up being, with some massive financial incentive at the end, or the belief in one existing at least. And I don't think that's necessarily evil. I think that's like reasonable. I think most people are in crypto to make money. And I don't think that's a sin. What I do think is problematic though is like sort of creating a structure which just like leads people on and incentivizes them to grind or like demonstrate their presence, if you will, without actually, a reason to do so or a real tangible reason to do so. I agree that one should reward loyalty, and I think one should reward like agency, etc. But I think that that has to be done in a manner that is not expected. Like I don't think that it should be, hey, if you do this, you'll get that. I think it should very much be that if people organically, choose to take on a set of behaviors, then you should do your best to help amplify the people and to give power to the people who are doing desirable things, right? And it's not like quests or missions or whatever to like build content or like make memes. I think those all sort of end in absolute shit. I think what you want more than anything else is to find a group of people who very much identify with the vision or the belief or the culture that you want to build, and then do your best to actually thin the crowd until you are left with more and more people who are a concentrated and perhaps smaller group, but are very representative of that which you want to espouse.
Mm.
So I guess like the way that I think about that community formation per se is you want to get to your core profile as quickly as possible. As in, you can there's like a number of different ways to approach it. I think one is like boil the ocean and try to build something that like everyone loves. I think the much more like meaningful one is to take a very concentrated bet and say, hey, like here's something that we believe, or here's the archetype that we sort of represent. And if you subscribe to it, wonderful. You'd probably be a great fit for a community. If you don't, maybe there's a place for you, but it may not be as clean, right? So I think that's part of what I've been, opining on a lot over time.
That's beautiful. Yeah, also Bitcoin, didn't do any airdrop or any incentivization. People are doing it from sheer belief. So I completely agree. So when speaking about belief, how did you make it clear? Like what is the beliefs and principles of Berachain culture? And then also, how did you make it clear and how did you get people the opportunity to participate in that beliefs? Did it all happen in a natural, organic way, or did you also encourage people to participate?
When I think about how we actually describe Berachain culture, I think there's a couple of different things. I think that we see a lot of Berachain as, I guess, an experiment that leads people to underestimate it in many ways. I don't mean this in a pick me like manner. I mean it more in that like it is very. I think it's about like I think looking beyond the surface level, if that makes sense. And that Berachain on its surface looks pretty stupid. It looks mimetic. It looks like goofy. It's like a bunch of bears. Like why the fuck is there a chain for a bunch of bears, etc. And it's very easy to like write that off on that on that initial impression, right? And I think that Berachain more than anything else is meant to be, I think, a representation of cognitive dissonance in many ways.
Hmm.
It's meant to be something that's a little bit confusing and that also does not necessarily fit into the mental model that people are willing to typically work with. And I do think that that is what tends to spur like more attention and sort of what actually like allows people to dial in a little bit more, because a thing that you understand perfectly does not necessarily stay in your brain for too long. You're like, okay, cool. This looks like all the other things that I've recently taken in or absorbed, right? Um, a thing that looks kind of fucked and like doesn't quite make sense, perhaps tends to stick around long enough if you don't write it off entirely. To be fair, right? So I think for us, a lot of it is okay. How does one marry, technical excellence and builder focused economics and a chain that's actually meant to very much turn certain models on their head, and I'd say reverse the standards, if you will. How do you marry that with like a bunch of retarded bears, right? Like
Hmm.
those are very much concepts that are not necessarily thought of in parallel. And I think that that's like a lot of what we try to do. And then I think a lot of it has also just been trying to cut through a lot of the BS, right? We don't try to be like wag me, like we're all gonna save crypto, and these are gonna be the values that define us for the years to come. I think that having a degree of both honesty and a degree of like not taking yourself that seriously are
Mm.
also incredibly important for us, like from a cultural point of view. And that I think a lot of the best and strongest founders in the Berachain ecosystem are very much able to flip on a switch, right? Like they can, be very serious if they need to be, but they can also fuck around and shitpost and meme and, like have as much fun as anyone else out there, right? And I think that that's very important from a relatability point of view, because I think that we've also seen a lot of people in crypto sort of build these like, giant floating castles in the sky, and sort of, just postulate about technological excellence without any means of demonstrating product market fit, um, or like building something that people actually want. And I think that that ends up just alienating communities over time. So I think being able to have like a number of figureheads and leaders in the ecosystem who do both, is really important. And in terms of what we've done to like, make this happen, I think it's been for the most part natural. Like I think we've just done our best to surround ourselves with partners, whether that's our VCs or our ecosystem projects or, service providers, whatever it might be, um, who I think subscribe to a similar school of thought, right? Or at least willing to help us subscribe to the same school of thought.
That's beautiful. Like what is not clear, like some people completely dismiss it, but the people that are not dismissing it are completely engaged. So it's very good to make this separation, because then you get like the most loyal people, and those people usually sticks with you, and not like halfway or there for a certain reason.
Yeah, you've got it, right? I think that the big thing is like, if you want to think about like the like classic Paul Graham type sayings, right? Like you'd rather have 10 people or 100 people that love your product than 1,000 or 10,000 people that like it, right? I think it very much goes the same, especially because they very much tend to set the tone for everything else in the same way that the first few hires on your team set the culture for the remainder of the team, and are very much what starts that flywheel. I think it's the very same for a community. Like your first, 15, 20 people very much inform who your next 5, 10 people are, and so on and so forth.
Hmm. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. So going back to the kind of origination story. So after you got a like, was it one NFT collection or a few NFT collections?
There
Like
were
before
6 in total so far.
six in total. Okay. So you basically move forward like with growing amount of people that believe in in that culture that you build, and then like how the idea for making a chain came about and how you merge this into the chain came about.
That one was definitely, funky. Um, I think that, the biggest thing that we saw was, as we spoke with this community over time, it was both like very like left curve and right curve, as mentioned, right? Like a lot of like, there's some people who are very NFT minded, some people who are very DeFi minded, definitely more like DeFi minded than NFT minded. We noticed some of the issues and some of the things that they were running into on a day-to-day basis, just because people would hang out in the Discord, chat about what's going on, all that kind of stuff. And I think it became evident to us that there were some certain, like, I'd say logical fallacies, if you will, between, the worlds of proof of stake, and the interactions that the application is building on top of them that didn't necessarily make sense to us, or members in our community, some of whom wanted to run nodes and wanted to be solo stakers, etc. And I think that the way that we thought about it for the most part was very much like, how do we build a system that actually aligns incentives between liquidity and security when allocating a given amount of capital? Because that's a pretty common, issue that users might face, especially if they're like to some extent power users, right? They've got 32 ETH. Do they choose to run a validator, or do they choose to LP in a DEX or a lending market? And they've certainly moved this in the right direction over time with stuff like Lido and Eigenlayer, et cetera. And I think that there's like, increasingly, more ways of sort of addressing this problem. But I think that for us, we really saw that, um, it made very little sense in proof of stake chains. These groups were effectively at odds with each other. So for us, we were like, okay, what if we build a mechanism or built a chain or something from the ground up that would enable us to solve a couple problems. One, this alignment issue, and two, the fact that like right now, when we look at any of the best applications that we see, or I wouldn't even say the best, just new and up and coming application builders, they have very little reason to exist on chain A versus chain B. You could perhaps make an argument for living on Ethereum versus Solana from just like a programming language point of view, speed point of view, etc. But when you look across, Aurora and Avalanche and Polygon and Arbitrum and Optimism, et cetera, even like Alt L1s versus L2s, there's very little reason to exist on one versus another, just except for just the amount of grant money that they throw at you,
Mm.
which we think was pretty stupid and very much a remnant of like a zero interest rates phenomenon time frame. So our thought process was, could we find a way to allow users liquidity to act as a form of security? Because really, all economics, like all stake is a unit of economic value that is underpinning a position security. When you get slashed, you're losing money, right? Now, does it really necessarily matter whether that money is in the form of ETH or Bera or Sol or Cardano, whatever it might be, right? That was sort of, I think, one of the more audacious points we were postulating. And also, why is it that one's liquidity could not be used to generate security? So I think that those were like some of our major takeaways. And then we also thought about how we could actually allow the chain itself to empower its applications. And I think that the combination of these different, thought processes, if you will, was what really sort of dialed in to eventually what became proof of
Wow,
liquidity.
that's amazing. Yeah. And then another thing that I was curious about between the developers and the participants. So how is the internal mechanism for kind of joining the community, either becoming like a participants working? Is there any flows that kind of making accessible to people that they can participate in, both as a participants or a developer, or it's all happening like in a natural organic setting?
I think that, there aren't like formal programs at the moment that are just, trying to say, hey, come, join us as a community member, come join us as a developer. It's very much, I think, like more word of mouth focused, if you will. So we're not doing any sort of questing. I think what we're actually focusing on more than anything else is identifying like just strong teams that we think are building products that people will really get excited about, and helping to bring them into the ecosystem. Because I think that a chain is absolutely useless without good applications on top of it. Um, at least right now, right? I think there's some point down the road in the future where like, just the payment layer becomes more interesting, the microtransaction layer becomes more interesting, and privacy, et cetera, becomes more interesting. But right now, I think chains really are defined by their applications. So the way we think about it is, our goal as ecosystem builders is to go and meet the best and brightest builders, help find out if they're a good fit for Berachain from a culture, from a product fit point of view, and from just a novelty point of view. And then, sort of take this B2B2C approach to actually bringing new folks into the ecosystem, right? So I think that's really how we think about tackling it, and try to figure out how we can, just ensure that the folks that are coming into the ecosystem are building net new things that actually have a chance of getting users. So while there isn't a formal process for, going and like, joining the Berachain ecosystem, it's our, ecosystem team, it's myself and other team members reaching out and talking to these guys on a daily basis, and doing just about everything we can to, give them a good home and make them feel, I think, well served, and arm them with all the resources they need to succeed in a new environment. And if they do a good job and we arm them effectively, then we really should be able to, I think, to help have the best class of application builders, which in turn attract useful users to the ecosystem.
Like two things that really amazed me when you're saying culture fit. You really see original, very specific things in the Berachain ecosystem, in the language that is very different. For example, smoke to earn is a very specific idea that no one else thought about, but it's very like a fit. And also what you did in ECC, like also you spoke about honesty. So these girls that say I'm paid to be here, that's so like refreshing, because previously people used to bring these kind of girls. Oh, I didn't pay for them, they
To be
just.
clear, that's a joke, right? That was
Yeah,
like
of course.
sarcastic. Okay, just making sure. But yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I see very unique things happening, very specific culture. But if you would want to say what is a culture market fit for Berachain, how would you describe it? Like what is the type of people that is a culture fit, both developers and users, and what is not? Like how would you describe it?
It's a good question, and I'll think about it a little bit more. Um, I think that for developers, you're probably a developer who is thinking a lot about capturing a new audience that, probably breaks the mold a little bit. You're also likely a developer who thinks a lot about capital efficiency and how they can make sure that their tokens and their, resources are used most effectively. And then I think you're probably a developer who thinks a lot about like branding to some extent and the ability to have a prominent place in a new ecosystem. I think that we've often seen from a number of Alt L1s, L2s, et cetera, to date, most chains can maybe sustain like, you know, 10 to 15, I'd say 20 on the upper end, good applications. And they really have the ability to sort of, work effectively there, right? I think that apart from that, you can have hundreds of other applications on the chain, but it's very tough to have them reach a meaningful degree of adoption or breakout potential, right? So I think you also have groups that are thinking, how do I become, that person or that group at the forefront of this Cambrian explosion? So I think on one hand, it's that type. In terms of the users, I think that we're still doing our best to best map the user archetype, right? I think that will ultimately be defined by the applications that we have there. But for example, if we take something like Puffball that you just mentioned, right? Like actually, like quit smoking slash vape to earn type beat, right? Which is it's definitely the kind of product that could exist on a number of different chains, and it can certainly have unique incentivization upsides by living on Berachain. But it's also just a little bit of that culture fit of like, hey, this is something that's kind of like cursed and can be seen as like like it's a little bit off the beaten path, but it's also quite interesting if you look beyond the surface a little bit, right? So I think those same sorts of ideas, which I mentioned before, that either are just the type of ones that I think cater to a fairly hip, like younger audience. So think between 18 to 35, raised in the internet era, exploring and looking at new opportunities, whether that be in gambling, social fi, DeFi, etc. I think that the application builder and the consumer ecosystem very much caters to like, explorers or people who want to try new things. I don't think that it has been, I don't think that it's been optimized yet for people who just want to sort of necessarily use the same applications that they've seen on every other chain. I think it's actually very much been sort of optimized for those who are like more experimental and want to try some cool new stuff they haven't seen before. Of course, there will still be all the vanilla primitives, so that if you want to use a basic standard stable swap, or if you want to use ConClick, or if you want to use like an Aave style money market, you'll have that opportunity. But I think that more than that, it's about the actual ability to try new things that you wouldn't have found somewhere else.
That's beautiful. Okay, I have like one more question, and then like if people here want to have some questions. Okay, so what would be your advice for new crypto founders that would like to think kind of culture first and product second? To think about what should be their mental models, what is the kind of mental model that they should avoid, and what is the kind of principles they should think about when they are starting a project and they want to think culture first and product second.
Yeah, I would advise the opposite, to be clear. I think that you should always have a strong product first,
Right.
and your product is really everything. Culture is incredibly important as well, but you definitely should never sacrifice it for product or vice versa, right? Like I think that like take the example of Solana. I think there's a lot of different ways you could observe Solana, but I think that having a strong product allowed them to build a stronger culture over time as well. A whole bunch of other stuff that factor into that, but I think you get where I'm coming from at a high level.
Just to clarify what I mean, there is a lot of founders. I mean, most of the founders that cares a lot about the product, but they're not. They almost like see their users as a separate thing, as an external thing, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
only think about the tactics instead of thinking about the users as part or as partners. So this is what I mean, like by
Yeah, no, that's entirely reasonable, and I think that what we've seen a lot of is, a lot of people building, like I mentioned, these castles in the sky, or they're like, sort of inaccessible technology solutions, without any users at the end of the day, or any community, if you will, or any culture that actually allows for distribution, right? And I think we're increasingly seeing people care more about distribution and how to actually get the product and the end hand of users. I think that you can sort of see this from like the Telegram ecosystem even more recently, right? Like I think people did not think about Ton very actively, or the vast majority were not necessarily talking about Ton for the last 6 to 12 months. But I'd say that within the last, let's say, 3 to 6 months, there's been a major resurgence in interest there, because they realize that there's actually a way of reaching, close to 10 million people who are actually like actively engaging in these sort of like on-chain crypto games, right? Whether they are making a ton of use of the TVM or not, that's a different question. But I think that we're starting to think about like getting product into the hands of people, and I do think that that's what culture enables at the end of the day. It is a different form of distribution. Like religions are the original form of distribution, right, of material and information, if you will. I think that chains in some ways very much, sort of resemble that. If we were to look at the other side and what you mentioned around, things that I would think about if I was a new founder, et cetera, and then how to go about all this, I think that the simple thing is Like if I had a magic wand and I could, sort of wave it and do it all over again, I think what you ideally want is a pretty decent or a good idea of a product, and something that you've been able to well validate with a sharp group of people who you think are representative of the market to start. With that product, I think you go and you start evangelizing that to a larger community, and make sure you can still get feedback, such that as you go from 50% complete to 100% complete or 75 to 100, you actually have the ability to take in, the information from others. I think in some cases that can cause a lot of whiplash, and you can have people pointing you in 10 different directions. But I think that it's useful as a set of guardrails or a set of inputs that you can use to say, okay, cool. Do we really need this feature? Do we really not need this feature? What do we actually care about? What do we not care about? Like use that to find your I'd say your North Star a little bit. And then I think the most important thing is that I've seen a lot of groups just like hop into this narrative of this habit of like narrative chasing, where it's like, hey, we're gonna be modular now, we're gonna be AI now, we got like some ZKs in there, like maybe there's some DPIN, like maybe it's restaked, I don't fucking know, right? And you just end up with a highly inaccessible word salad that no one really cares about or thinks about. Um, I actually think that taking a somewhat more like Shakespearean approach to it is more interesting. I think you really do want to be in a business of category creation as opposed to category subscription. And I think it's fine to be able to say, hey, actually, we have optionality or the ability to subscribe to this or that narrative. So, for example, one can talk about Berachain as a relatively modular L1 because we do separate consensus from execution, but we don't try to brand ourselves as a modular chain. We could talk about, our affiliation with Cosmos. I hate Cosmos. I think it sucks. But that's always a call option, right? I think that more than anything, we talk about how we actually try to build this narrative or build an ecosystem around proof of liquidity and how to make that something that people actually care about, understand at some point, evangelize, and that sort of becomes the talk piece. And I think what I've noticed from a lot of the teams that have done branding or cultural distribution best, while building technical solutions in the last few months, um, is actually that they have a word, they have something that they sort of stick in everyone's heads. I think half the people at best, and probably 80 or 20% of people at best actually understand what it is. But if you say the thing enough times and you build enough information around what it might be, and sort of have it adjacent to enough things that people understand, then I think it actually starts to get the point across. I don't think that most people know what the fuck data availability is. I don't think most people really understand what modularity is. But I think if you say modular money and build whatever enough times, as the Celestia team did, you sort of end up building something that people understand. And then that sort of, starts spurning more and more culture, right? I think same thing for eigenlayer and restaking. I think most people have no fucking idea how restaking works. They're just like, cool, maybe more yield on my ETH, right? Which is like not a bad thing to think about, right? But I think that being able to actually sort of build that narrative and then have a whole bunch of people run with that torch actually starts to create that culture around it, right? Um, so I guess I would say like, think about how you actually want to cement that brand or cement that image in people's heads and what that tidbit of information looks like that you can feed to people to get them interested. Think about how you can make that stand out, not for the sake of standing out, but in a manner that is actually digestible from an information acquisition point of view. Um, and then think a lot about how you can actually select for the right initial community that allows you to build the type of culture you want. So if you want a bunch of like absolute gigabrain, like basement dweller, not talking to any women ever, like if you just want straight up devs who will not see the light of day, but will build the most cracked thing that you've ever considered, then figure out how you find those groups, right? Do you trawl certain GitHubs? Do you find certain products that attempted things like previously in the past and, hit them up on a one by one basis? How do you curate that initial group that serves as the baseline for the network effects to define your community or your culture after? I think that's probably the part that I see least discussed or least thought about, because it's also like the part that is toughest to, I'd say, like premeditate, if you will. Like I think very few people are like, okay, I'm gonna look for this profile to start my community. I think in more cases it's people, dropping a Discord link and maybe having some retweeted announcements from VCs or friends or whatever, and then saying, okay, cool, like hopefully a bunch of people care now. And in many cases, it could whittle down to that same group over time. But it's a lot tougher to, to reverse the trend of a community going in the opposite direction than you like.
Wow, yeah, for sure. That's a lot of gems. Like to tap into an existing community that think like what part do you see like is a product side of thing and as a as a culture side of things? Like when you say tap into existing community, like in the Berachain, it was, I guess, Olympus and other DeFi communities. Like what part of it you think the
I think I get what you mean though. Like I think that you need a product or you need a product spec or a vision that people care enough about or identify with enough to evangelize. As in, I think of the product very much as a baseline, as it has to meet some threshold of, okay, it allows me to accomplish this or that I couldn't have before, and as a result, I care about it, right? Like, how does this product improve my life? How does this product make my life easier? And why should I care about it? I think is like one of the most important things. And then I think that you build the culture around that because you want to have a whole bunch of people being able to say, oh, like this is actually really cool. And I understand why I should care about it. But I think it's a lot tougher to build a culture and then build a product around it. I just think we kind of did that a little bit by accident. And I do think that our culture has evolved a ton since, mentioning the product. Like I think it's very different from when it was just an NFT project, right? I think that it attracts a different, group of people. But nonetheless, I think that it very much has I think that the product has to come first and the culture has to help it evolve.
amazing. Well, I mean, this was very like inspiring, a lot of gems, a lot of things. Like we'll also record it and we'll be able to share. But if anyone here have some questions,
I will jump into the conversation. So for me, I think like one of the like most interesting questions, given the current market conditions and many different launches that were considered like more successful or less successful, is that like there is this general feeling in the market that the playbook of how you should launch your project and build a community is kind of, it's lost its edge. Everyone kind of running the same playbook of build a community, create some kind of a test net, or I don't know, airdrop campaign and just launch your token. And it feels like this is like highly unsustainable growth strategy, which kind of create like this initial pump and hype that instantly like gets much slower, almost like immediately. So what your thoughts on that? How do you think like the strength of the community can affect that, and how you create a community that goes beyond like this initial TGE moment in which everyone are kind of like dumping or keeping their tokens in that case?
Yeah, it's a reasonable question, man. I think there's a few different elements that play into it. There's always a lot of history and there's a lot of nuance in like how that community was formed and what that staying power or initial attraction point was. But I also agree that TG is where things like become real or not, right? Um, I think more and more I've seen like TGEs or airdrops is like people think about them to some extent as user acquisition events. I think they're actually more about like buying sentiment. Like I think that what people are left with an airdrop is in most cases like, do they feel good or bad about your project? Right? And that also tends to have these network or ripple effects that I've mentioned. Um, so I think that the most important thing, and where I've seen most people like take a less thoughtful approach, is actually being able to reward the users that matter and reward the people that have actually contributed in some tangible sense, right? And I think that that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, and it's meant to have some degree of barriers to entry. This goes into another point I think about a lot, which is like most pre-launch ecosystems or most pre-launch communities are pretty barren, right? Like there's been a long-standing this belief that if you build it, people will come. I heavily disagree with that. I think there's like nearly infinite options for people to go through and lots of places that'll like, throw money at you, etc., to come build things on them. And I don't think that that actually works anymore. I think that the only way to actually make people, want to build with you is by putting in the time and the effort to actually help, them solve their problems and get different things across the line, right? So I think that if you take the right strategy that allows you to identify different opportunities or identify the different people within a given community, whether that be certain testnet users, whether that be certain content creators, whatever it might be, who have actually, played a meaningful path in that project's evolution, along with, in my opinion, the people building around or on that project who are theoretically the most important, right? So in certain applications, this could be people who are building strategies or building applications on top of them. On chains, it could be people who are building those category defining applications on the testnet, right? I think that as opposed to just being like, hey, these guys did a quest on my testnet, and now I'm going to give you some tokens for you to dump. Um, like I think that accomplishes very little. I think you accomplish a lot more by identifying the profiles of the users that matter and that you think will be most valid and most helpful to the ecosystem over time, and then finding a way to reward them in a manner that is also long-termist. Um, so I think that there's a lot of design space to be played with there that really has not, been explored a ton as of yet, and we intend on doing some of that. And then I also think that it's important to like, find ways to think about how your users are ultimately going to benefit from whatever you're building. And in many cases, that is, fiscally to some extent as well, right? So how are you going to make your users rich in some sense? Is that going to be you? Is that going to be the project building around you? What is their path towards like loyalty, if you will? And I think that that is. I know I haven't answered your question directly, but I think that my biggest thing to take away there would be like figure out who matters the most to your ecosystem. In most cases, in my mind, that's builders and power users and people who have demonstrated long-term allegiance and aren't just like sort of hopping from trend A to trend B. And if you identify those properly and then empower those people, you will likely help create the sorts of network effects you want. While at the same time, still being able to take shots and effectively find a way to spread out some tokens to people who you think could be good fits, right? And might just need sort of a little bit of a hook to pull them in.
Thank you for that. Following up exactly on like this area, so would love also to hear your take about a kind of ecosystem incentives, especially for builders. I'm familiar with Build a Bera, which is kind of an accelerator and incubator inside of the Bera ecosystem, right? So, like, what's your kind of angle there? What do you think makes it like different versus like other type of methods like grants or just in general, like how do you think incubation and acceleration within ecosystem should be done?
Yeah, good question, man. I think like I mentioned before, right? Most ecosystems tend to be defined by some 10 to 20 apps that end up being like what that chain for, right? So if you looked at the Terra ecosystem, it was Anchor and Mars Protocol and like Astroport and that sort of stuff. If you looked at Harmony, it was DeFi Kingdoms. If you looked at Arbitrum, it was GMX at some point, so on and so forth. um, and I think a lot of those tend to be able to spawn really strong application ecosystems around them. um, I think that grants and I think that tokens are the cheapest resource that one can give to a builder. I also think that they're the lowest utility resource that one can give to a builder, because you actually sort of put them in a really weird catch-22. If you give them tokens, they just sell your tokens in order to sustain their operations. And it's like, cool, I just paid someone to build on me by selling my token, which just feels like really weird incentives and like just nonsensical in my opinion. Um, and if you give them, I guess cash or USTCs, like treasuries type stuff, then sure that works too. But you've just effectively said, hey, I have to like my chain is not good enough for you to build here by yourself. You have to be paid to build here. Um, and I think that in most cases, there are certain cases, to be fair, where like retroactive programs are effective. I think in most cases, grants just sort of encourage or empower the type of builders who could not build a good enough product to either be bootstrapped or to get off the ground via VC funding themselves. I think they can play a reasonable role, especially in public goods type projects. So if you have like a new block explorer or like, Dune dashboard type stuff, I think the grants on those sorts of like middleware type solutions, if you will, that help enable another class of builders is quite useful. But I think that in most cases, they end up being a very unsustainable and like misaligned means to an end of getting people to build. So our approach with Build-A-Bear and the incubation side of things is that we try to select 5 companies every few months. We're doing it on like between a 3 and 6 month basis that we think are building things that are very net new and that could really be category defining or milestone applications on Berachain. The focuses change over time. So initially a little bit more DeFi heavy, now a little bit more consumer like and sort of like distribution heavy, if you will. And also trying to find groups that we think will be there to really stay for the long term. And I think that we, on one hand, contribute some capital in that investment, but more than anything else, I think we're contributing our time and our expertise, whatever it's worth. And I think that that is the most scarce and the most useful resource to a builder, in terms of being able to work with someone and say, hey, how do I figure out my go-to-market? How do I figure out my tokenomics? What should my process be for my fundraise over here? Which investors are good to work with? Which investors are not good to work with? How do I think about building out a team, hiring, branding, all that kind of stuff? Our goal is really to be an extension of the team and their first call whenever something's going wrong or whenever something's going right, so that they can have a resource or a helping hand, and sort of adjacent scar tissue to rely on. And I think that that is sort of infinitely more valuable than a grant, because I think you sort of just get like this whole, teach a man to fish versus give him a fish sort of dynamic. We would much rather, teach them how to build a great company than say, hey, like, here's something that'll keep you alive for 2 months. So that's sort of our approach on it.
Cool. Thank you, Smokey.
I think that you guys have innovated on lots of different means and mechanisms to draw in a community and award specific members of it that you guys have been touching on. There's obviously a new cohort of projects that are thinking through their TG or may launch soon. What other ecosystems or what other tactics from other sort of protocols or dApps, what tactics, for building community or awarding the community do you guys find interesting that you might sort of consider for the Berachain ecosystem?
Yeah. For us, I think that we we try quite hard to make sure that we are never in the business of copying other people's approaches. Just because I don't know, I think that especially in a space that has like ADD as crypto, um, novelty wears off so quickly, and novelty also like kind of only works once. Like I think these points programs and whatnot are mostly useless and just sort of end up being bait for people, really. So that's exactly why we haven't, run stuff like that and are doing our best to avoid anything like that going into TG. I think there are certain initiatives I think have value. I don't think we'd necessarily run them ourselves. I think monads like missions and like I don't know exactly how it's done. I know there's sort of like a web of interactions there, but I think in many cases encouraging community members to create content can certainly have some value. I've seen that generate a large like following and I think a large degree of engagement on different social media platforms. I think Tapioca DAO did something quite interesting recently with like their OTAP tokens that effectively airdrop people an option that allowed them to buy the token at a lower price. But it also meant that like they were contributing to the protocol treasury, but they're also getting an opportunity to get in at a favorable price, right? So I think that like stuff like that, where it's like, hey, we're not just giving you free money, but we're actually giving the right people, or theoretically the right people, an opportunity to get skin in the game in a manner that gives them upside, but also drives value to the protocol, is also quite interesting. I think just like moving towards more and more approaches that have a good degree of sustainability have been top of mind for us. So in short, man, I don't think that there's anything that we would like look to implement ourselves from other ecosystems at the moment. And we've definitely got a few designs cooking in the back of our heads for what a TG/launch rollout could look like. But I think there's certainly groups that I've seen do interesting things over time that I have a lot of respect for.
Hello, I have a quick one for Smokey, actually. Hello, Yanni. As I'm getting more, Nicola from Lemscap, Smokey here. As I'm getting more and more familiar with the model, it seems like to me that the idea is to sort of have call it like not a recurring airdrop, but like a continuous airdrop towards the community and the applications directly, right? Like I'm getting familiar with the economics behind getting BGT directly, basically from the nodes, right? And the economic interactions between the protocols and the nodes themselves, with infrared as infrastructure for that. So I find it very interesting. My question is how dynamic that could be, and how do you see, like, do you see that as initial design, or something that it's a big bet and you will write it, or you will fine tune along the way? Like, I'm trying to understand how rigid and or dynamic this model will be along the way when you have tested out and you see the reaction and you see how the community basically try to bribe each other somehow to gain those streams of tokens from the chain itself. And thank you.
Yeah. Gotcha. Hey, Nicola, good to see you again. I think that on one hand, I think that what will become more flexible or modular, if you will, over time, are the different ways in which one can effectively return value or bribe or incentivize BGT holders to direct emissions to one pool or one application over another. Which is to say that to start, it can be relatively simple in terms of just like tokens, right? Like ERC20 type stuff, right? What I think can be even more interesting over time is, and this is of course like a tech lift as well, but is allowing effectively different correlated values, if you will, to be returned to people who are incentivizing a pool. So right now, the logic, just for context and improve liquidity, and what Berachain uses is that the validator set effectively directs BGT, or the native staking/rewards token emissions, towards different applications on the chain. And users of those applications, which have been voted in via governance, are basically able to receive the BGT tokens via using the application as they would normally, LPing the pools that are being incentivized by validators. And the users who basically have earned BGT, which is only obtained via by providing liquidity in the network and cannot be bought or sold, can only be earned from LPing, are actually able to stake with different validators or delegate that BGT to different validators and choose, basically help compound which pools get the most emissions. The structure is really that those who contribute the most liquidity or the most value as we see it to the ecosystem are those who have the greatest say in how incentives are distributed across the ecosystem. Now, where I think this could evolve is that, right now a user can say, or a protocol can say, hey, I'm going to incentivize this validator to direct more emissions towards my pool versus someone else's pool by giving them a number of tokens. Now, what could get even more interesting over time is if that application, that user could say, hey, I'm actually going to give this, I'm going to give these, I'm going to effectively bribe or incentivize people with X% of fees generated from my protocol, or with like Y% of commissions generated from this, right? Such that it's your success as an application, or success as someone who's bribing an application, is actually even more correlated to the application's outcomes. So in short, Nicola, I don't think that the structure of like applications receiving BGT from validators will change, but I think that the dynamics around what might incentivize a validator to push incentives towards a given application may evolve over time.
Got you. Thanks a lot.
And just for I think that this becomes very interesting in the context of things outside of DeFi, in terms of NFTs, gaming, etc., where you can effectively have certain actions incentivized to a point, or think about OpenSea commissions at one point and how much people were making. Imagine if some portion of that was being sent towards delegates of a given validator, right? I think that kind of stuff gets really interesting over time.
Smokey, thank you very much for this conversation. It was really inspiring. I think a lot of people can learn a lot, lessons, and it will be recorded and edited, and we'll send, like, if you want to share, like, the idea is to help, like, the future founders in crypto to understand and to build, better with these principles. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. And
yeah, cheers, guys. Thanks for having me. Happy to answer questions if anyone ever has them in the future. Just feel free to hit me up.